Hello and welcome to my video all about the differences between Continental and English style knitting. I'm going to demonstrate both of them whilst also describing the differences. Other styles include Norwegian, combination and Portuguese. Now Continental knitting is what I'm going to start with, and this is thought to have originated in Germany or thereabouts and then spread across Europe. When Europeans emigrated, they took their knitting style with them to countries like America. Now the Continental knitting style, which can also be called German knitting or left-hand knitting, is often referred to as picking. Now picking describes the motion of the needles when knitting Continental, because as I'm going to demonstrate, you take the needle and push it through the stitch and then kind of hook it around the yarn behind and pull it forward. So it's like picking the yarn from behind the needles. With Continental knitting, the working yarn is held in the left hand and is often threaded between the fingers of the left hand to keep the tension. So this is how knit stitches are formed in the Continental style. As you can see, the right hand needle is doing the work. You'll also see that the motion of the right hand needle is quite small, there's not much movement going on. And also the yarn behind the needles is quite close to the needle tip. And so again, the actual movement required for Continental is quite limited. This means that people who perhaps have problems with their joints or with repetitive strain injury prefer Continental knitting over English. Also, a lot of people find it to be quicker than English. However, people who have won the world's fastest knitting competitions have knitted with both Continental and English styles. So I think it just more depends on the person who's knitting as to what kind of speed they can achieve. And now I'm just going to demonstrate purling in Continental knitting. As you can see, it demands limited movement again. You don't have to move your whole hand to wrap the yarn around the needles. And you can see that picking motion a bit more clearly with the needle now, as it comes through the stitch, hooks around the yarn and pulls it back through the stitch. And now we move on to English style knitting, which is my style of knitting and the one I've always used and the one I was taught as a child. I think a lot of people stick with the style that they first were taught, and I think there's nothing wrong with that at all, but when it comes to things like Fair Isle, it really helps to know both Continental and English style knitting. And also there's nothing against doing both styles, so if you find purling really awkward in Continental, you could do purling with English style and knitting with Continental style and just switch between them. English style can also be called right-hand knitting because the working yarn is held in the right hand this time rather than the left. It can also be referred to as throwing in reference to the motion of your right hand. So I'm just going to demonstrate knit stitches here, and you take your needle up through the stitch on the left hand and you wrap the yarn around the needle tip at the back. Now this motion of wrapping requires your hand to do quite a large movement, and it kind of looks like you're throwing the yarn around that needle tip, hence the name throwing. This large hand movement often puts people off English style knitting because they think that looks really awkward or it looks really slow and cumbersome. And I suppose if you're used to Continental, then it will seem that way. However, I've always done English style and I just find it comes completely natural to me. So I think it all depends on what's comfortable for you. And that's why I recommend trying both styles. And now I'm just going to demonstrate purling with English style. As with Continental knitting, the yarn is at the front towards you, and the needle goes down through the top stitch on the left hand needle. And then you do that throwing motion again and complete the stitch. And that is a demonstration of knitting and purling in both the Continental and English styles. The English style of knitting is very popular in English-speaking countries, as you would expect. And what's interesting is that World War II had an effect on knitting habits. Now, because continental knitting was associated with Germany, during the war, people distanced themselves with anything to do with Germany. So a lot of countries involved in the war, or not, abandoned continental knitting in favour of English-style knitting. But then gradually it was reintroduced and now is very popular. Both the continental and English knitting styles are used in England now, and America, and also all across the world really. Japanese knitters are more likely to knit continental style, whilst Chinese knitters are more likely to use English style. So it often depends on the country and the history of the country, whether the continental style or the English style is most popular. I really hope you found that interesting and useful, and thank you very much for watching.